Body Safety Australia acknowledges and pays respects to all traditional custodians and elders of this nation and the continuation of cultural, spiritual and educational practices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. This podcast was recorded in Naarm on Wurundjeri country of the Kulin Nation, and we acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Welcome to The Kids Are Okay, your go-to podcast for making the hard chats easier. I'm Lauren French.
And I'm Deanne Carson.
And today we're going where every right-wing politician goes every election cycle, trans young people.
Trans young people?
I know.
They don't exist.
You'd be shocked, Deanne, shocked.
All jokes aside, Lauren, this is what we want to talk about. Transgender children exist. Transgender young people exist. Them existing is not a revolutionary idea. They're just going to school and eating their lunch and hanging out with their friends, and yet the media just take their lives and make political football.
And what we see often is that in media it's often discussed as something purely in secondary schools.
Right.
As something that we need to be worried about or concerned about, or media are often putting it in very negative spins around what secondary school, what that looks like to be inclusive of trans young people.
Yeah, because I think there's this narrative around the fact that even talking about transgender people is not age appropriate. So, of course, we're not going to talk about transgender children because their very existence isn't age appropriate according to the narrative. Yeah.
Which is insane that we could say to a trans young person, you are not age appropriate for yourself.
Right. Yeah. We can't talk about you because you're too young to learn about you.
Yeah, 100%. I'm really curious because we'll get into it in a minute of where we see this and where this intersects with our work, particularly in the past little while where we've seen this heavy pushback, let's say, on our work. However, I've been in the space for a number of years and have noticed the cyclical conversations that have been happening. Not an age comment, but you've been in the space slightly longer. And I'm curious to know when this first became on your radar.
Sure. I think from the first time I started teaching sex ed, which was about 2010, I noticed that the organisation that I was working with, we were allowed to talk about same-sex attraction, and we were allowed to talk about, and I'm talking in primary school, I'm not talking in high school. We were allowed to talk about the fact that some kids have two mums, right? That's okay because some kids do have two mums. And we were allowed to talk about the fact that when we go through puberty, we can feel sexual and romantic feelings towards other people, and sometimes they're towards people of the same sex as us. And sometimes it's just kind of a phase. I kid you not. And
the phase. Who doesn't love a good phase?
Yeah, I love a good phase. I've been in my phase for quite some time now and it's working well for me. And I kept on, I was kind of naive in this space. I kept on saying, I know these amazing people who can come and do professional development around being transgender, like transgender people who are working for trans organisations who can come and do some PD because, obviously when we're talking about sex and gender, we want to talk about that too, right? And they kept on putting me off. Oh, yeah. And it took me a while to realise that it was too hot a topic. And I think that was, one of the reasons. There were many reasons, but that was one of the reasons why I established BSA, because I know that there are transgender children. I have a transgender child and I know that they have the same right to education around their bodies, about their relationships, about their, capacity to go on school camp or use the toilet or engage in sports as any other child. But you picked up on something before, and that's the cyclical nature of this conversation. I think that's something that I've seen over time. I think, for a while, it just was not on anyone's radar. Concerned adult. When I say concerned, I don't really mean concerned, right?
Yeah, not actually concerned.
Not actually concerned. Adults were more worried about, homosexuality, right? They were more worried about the fact that I, as a queer woman, was going to come in and teach their kids how to be queer. And I did have a lot of threats towards me. And it wasn't until I think the marriage equality campaign that started to change, and the focus really started to be on transgender children and young people and their families as well.
And I'm curious, when we talk about that cyclical space, that fact that this is something we see every however many months, every election period, these conversations keep coming up. I'm really curious because, as you said, this is something that has been used when we talk about homosexuality and this sort of space. And I know you were telling me a story of a kind of incident that happened in that political space and then the next day at school.
Oh my God, yes. I think it must have been the marriage equality campaign, and there was a politician whose name shall not be revealed because, I don't have money for a lawyer, who was on the news. And this was really early in the campaigning. So this wasn't after things had ramped up. It was really early in the campaign, and he was on the news linking homosexuality to bestiality, right? And as a queer person, I was horrified at that and also kind of stunned at how brazen that kind of rhetoric was, right? But that's right wing.
Yeah.
So, but it wasn't until I went to a school the next day teaching grade 5, 6, puberty education, talking about, as you go through puberty, you might have romantic or sexual feelings. And this one child just shot up their hand and went, do gay people have sex with animals? And so I'm standing in this class of, 24 children who are just curious. He didn't mean any harm by that. Going, that is the power. That is the power of politicians' rhetoric or shock jocks' rhetoric. And it's intentional, right? And so we see this go on. So that was probably, I don't know, 2015 maybe, that happened. But we see this every time there's an election cycle, and the news cycle is full of, trans people are going to, eat your babies.
They're going to ruin sport. They're going to terrorize all the things. And particularly
they're going to be in our jails.
Yeah,
anyone cared about incarcerated people before.
Well, exactly. It's always the joke of the only time people care about women's sport is when we're talking about trans women.
Yeah.
And there's this sort of thing of the only time we're putting a light or putting people up in this perspective is when we're talking from a negative of this fear-mongering of nothing. Yeah.
So, but what happens in that space is that the children are confused by what they hear. They may or may not talk about it with their families. They come into school, we come in and we have these conversations and they ask these questions. But what's also happening is that there are trans children sitting in the same classroom with them. So it's not just me or you or any of our educators who are impacted at this point. When somebody goes, do trans people eat babies? I'm using that as an example because it sounds really trite. Yeah,
obviously that is ridiculous.
Yeah, it is. But it's this space of people can say anything they want, right? With, maybe there are repercussions, maybe they're not, but the people that it impacts are, for us, what we see, the children in the classroom who quite innocently ask that question, and sitting in their classroom is a transgender or a gender diverse child who goes, that's me you're talking about.
And to be clear, this is not an idea of what could happen. This is what is currently happening. It was not that long ago I was in a year 3-4 classroom where I had that exact experience of not only children in the room telling me, you know, I'm non-binary, you know, do this, and telling me about trans people in their lives. And then I also had children telling me, yeah, but trans people don't exist in the same classroom.
Right. And how do they reconcile that? Because this information is coming from somewhere, right? Whether they're hearing it in social media or on TikTok, you know, on YouTube themselves, or whether it's rhetoric that, you know, family or community have told them. How do they reconcile that with the fact that at lunchtime, one of the people that they like to hang out with the most is transgender, and yet they've got the message somewhere that this child doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the media cycle, and, you know, every time there's an election, whether it's a federal election or a state election, you know, this kind of rhetoric amps up. But where is it coming from, do you think, Lauren?
Well, it's that interesting thing of going, this is not just an Australian context. No. And this is something that us as Australia is being influenced quite heavily to international voices. And so when we think about spaces like the US, there's a lot of people that I've been speaking to will see some of the conversations in the US and go, that's absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
Like it seems extreme. They're talking about all these things and these laws and there's this sort of stuff. And it's almost seen as well, we're not like that. And it's seen as this really clear divide of what is ridiculous and what is okay, which is what we're doing.
Totally. And I think the US really started this conversation, and what was interesting, where they failed in influencing us, is that they really focused on bathrooms, right?
Yeah.
What we know as toilets. And I don't know if you know this, Lauren, but in the US, if you go to a public toilet, there are gaps around the door. Like you can actually see.
Yeah.
From outside, you can see the person inside the cubicle.
Yeah, US. What's with that?
There are a lot of questions.
I was out of all the things for the US, just bathrooms.
So when they started this whole conversation about trans women using the women's toilets and going, you know, children might see a penis, in Australia we were like, I don't even understand how that happens, because you go to the bathroom and you shut the door and the door is shut and then you do your business. And that's all they wrote. Right. Yeah. Whereas in the US, they've got the gaps, right? So they lost us at the start. The conversation never got up because we were like, what are you weirdos doing? Are you like climbing under the cubicle and looking up people's skirts to see what genitals they have? Like, you're the weird one.
If you're doing that, you are 100% the weird one, to be really clear. Yeah, but I completely see that. And so the US was having these conversations, but we weren't really being sucked into them in the same way. But then the UK happened.
Yeah, what's commonly known now as Turf Island. Yeah.
And what we saw there was, unfortunately, much smarter and strategic in that way of how they were kind of approaching the conversation.
So what happened there is, you know, there were a small group of women who called themselves, and let's be clear, they called themselves this to start with, trans exclusive radical feminists. So kind of feminist separatists, right?
Yeah.
Who were arguing for sex-based rights. And they were a lot smarter, you know, about how they went about things, and they really spoke to feminism around, you know, girls and women's rights to safety, and you know, the work that feminists have done over the decades or centuries to gain rights. And let's be clear, their rhetoric is still based in nonsense. But the way that they went about it appealed much more to this kind of intellectual approach.
Well, they covered it up in academia and in, you know, intrigue and intellect, and they made it this thing of, oh, we're these hugely smart feminists, therefore this is a more profound understanding of it. And if you too are a smart feminist, then this is where you should be.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly what they did. So, and again, I'm not going to name names, but that had a much greater appeal in certain feminist circles in Australia. But then also what happened was, and I find this really interesting, there was a radicalisation that happened in online spaces. And when we talk about radicalisation, we're often talking about boys and men and being radicalised towards misogynistic or Islamophobic or, racist behaviours, right? But we equally saw girls and women being radicalised towards transphobic behaviours. And that was done really, really cleverly, really. So first it wasn't about sports first, but it was about prisons, and it was about, let's think of women in prison, and they've been through such a terrible time, and they're victims themselves, and this percent of women who are incarcerated have experienced sexual violence, and now you want to put somebody with a penis in there, right, without any evidence, none.
And that's the thing, for a lot of these arguments, when you start to unravel them, there is no evidence because they can't be based on evidence because, as we said, it's complete bollocks. But they're coming from that thing of when you're talking about it, like as you just said, of course, the response is, oh, well, of course we can't put a penis near them. Like we would be the bad people if we weren't protecting, if we weren't worrying about this.
Yeah. But look, the reality is that this is a war that's being waged online. But with very real impacts in the real world. But the numbers of people, right, who are whipping up this transphobic frenzy are actually minute. They're really, really small. Like if you listen to, the transphobia coming out of the UK, they'd have you think that they speak for all women.
Yeah.
And yet it's such a small number of people, and they have you think that they speak for all lesbians because,
they're just being loud.
But, well, they're being loud. They're being very, very active online. They're not even being that loud outside of online spaces. They're just super active online. They have 50 million accounts. They're in all of the spaces there, and they're reaching out to where women are. They're reaching out to, they're on Mumsnet talking to mums about, oh no, your daughter's going to go on school camp, with somebody who's trans, and you won't have any right in it, So they're really active and they're really vocal, and they make their numbers look much greater than they are. And particularly in Australia, the numbers are quite small. But what has also happened on a political front is that other people who intend harm have caught on to, the anti-trans rhetoric, and they've joined forces because they're just looking for trouble. Right?
But it's almost as if you have a platform that is preaching hate, you're going to attract other platforms that preach hate.
Well, of course. And what we see then are people who actually have no interest in LGBTIQ people at all, trans people specifically, who just go, this is the platform that I'm going to use to get my face on the news, and they're dangerous. They're like we saw in Melbourne at the beginning of the year, where there was an anti-trans speaker from the UK who came out, and the Nazis thought it would be a really great idea for them to join that platform,
because they could, because it was a platform that was aligned.
Yeah.
Because, there was a lot of people post that event that were saying, but it's not like the anti-trans protest invited Nazis there.
No, but
that's not the point.
Yeah. And you can't say that you care about women and girls when you align yourself with a group, a rabble of men, because they are predominantly men, who intend violence towards women and girls. You can't say that. So, but I don't even want to talk about them. I don't want to give them any more air than they're beginning with. What I want to talk about is the amazing, extraordinary trans and gender diverse children that we work with in schools.
Yes, I agree, because TERFs are like groundhogs. They pop up when you least expect them, and they kind of pop up everywhere. And I think when the reason, not just because this is important and, makes sense to talk about, but this is something that has come up a lot in our work. And the reason that comes up is because when we're doing comprehensive sexuality education, we often talk about the fact that we go into schools, we have inclusive environments, and we are teaching facts. We are giving young people all an equal opportunity to understand what is normal, what is happening to their bodies. We are not there to teach values or to, have those really conversations that are about this is right, this is wrong, because this is something to go home and talk about, because this is around family values, or this is around, community, cultural understandings.
But values, while important, are individual, right? So, what's our values around using tampons rather than pads, or using reusable rather than disposable, or using spray deodorant over, roll-on deodorant or natural deodorant. These are values things. Or often if we're teaching about babies, values might be around, whether God made the egg and the sperm that came together to make the baby. We teach the fact an egg and a sperm come together, but the values might be, but God chose that egg and chose that sperm, which is absolutely the family's prerogative. But when it comes to human rights, when it comes to a child's right to be safe at school, to exist in their identity, whether that's around their faith, race, disability, sexuality, and gender identity, they're not values.
And I think that is often conflated. And what you see and what you start to hear in community, and what I also get told by educators that is the fear, is that if you do this work, if you are inclusive in your language, in your conversation, that people in the community are not going to be okay with this because it goes against their family values. And that's the distinction that needs to be made, is this isn't about family values. This is about the rights of children.
It's about human rights.
Yeah. And not even just the rights of the children, while, yes, that is paramount. Yeah. What about the rights of the educators, the teachers in the room, our educators that walk in?
Well, half of our staff are trans or non-binary. So absolutely, as an employer, it's always at the forefront of my mind. Are my staff safe when they're in their workplace? So if they go into a school and they're told, no, you can't talk about pronouns, and they literally have they, them pronouns, what is being asked of them? To erase their identity?
And I think that's it. That's exactly what's being asked of them. But it's being convoluted in this idea of, but we can't force this on people. It can't be, can't go against because it goes against what someone personally believes. Okay, cool. But again, this needs to be separated from that.
Okay. So Lauren, this is all great. We can sit here all day and go, yay, we love trans people. Trans people are our family and our friends and our colleagues and all of these sorts of things. But what does this actually mean for the classroom? If you've got families who are saying, no, I don't want you to talk about gender diversity in the classroom because we don't believe in that, how do teachers navigate that? Or how do parents of trans kids support their school in navigating that? Like, how do we do this work while knowing that there may be members of the community who do hold beliefs that are harmful to trans children?
It's a really heavy question because I think a lot of educators do come up to this wall and go, I don't know, it is too hard. in the past where this wall has come up for us is often when we're going into communities, into schools, and we haven't been able to have a parent community workshop like we normally do and like is best practice.
Yeah.
And what happens there is, let's say, it's end of term. They've realized nothing on puberty has been done. Something needs to come in and we're rushing in the last week, and they go, there's no time to talk to the families. And we go, okay, that's not best practice. Would love to do this later. But yes, I understand it's either now or never for the children of getting some puberty education. Okay, well, something better than nothing. But in those situations, what we find is that either there is a loud minority of parents, sometimes it's one parent
yeah.
who has reached out to the school and gone, this is not okay.
Mm-hmm.
And because we haven't had a workshop, because there hasn't been a forum for a larger amount of families to come together and not only learn about the content and how completely age appropriate and fine it is, and how we incorporate spaces for family values, and because there hasn't been an opportunity for those families to see other families okay with it, you've got one very loud voice dictating the education for the entire school.
And I think that's a really important point you make, because we can say, children are protected by legislation, they're protected by the Child Safe Standards, they're protected, by, lots and lots of regulations. But when you have that one family, if they're spending a lot of time online or in siloed communities, they may think that the support is much greater than it is, like we were saying before. And if they come into a forum where, we're answering all of the questions, this is what we're going to be talking about. This is how we talk about it. This is how we support you in your values. And they realize that actually every other family in their community is like,
this is great. I love that this is happening.
Great, but almost disinterested. Like, of course you're talking about trans kids because they exist. Like, whatevs. So having said that, one, we know in school environments or in early childhood environments, one voice can, really influence the decision making in that space. It often just takes one parent to say, trans people are ruining the world, right? For a principal or an early childhood director to sort of get frightened and back down. I'm interested to hear from you, like, what kind of rhetoric are you hearing now in that space?
Well, it's really interesting because there's been a big shift.
Yeah.
And previously the rhetoric, the loud voice was saying it's not age appropriate. Right. And it was this kind of conversation of it's not okay, it's not age appropriate, it's not with our family values, but there was this understanding of it's okay to talk about in secondary school when you have to. But so the argument was it's not age appropriate. And that was a slightly easier for educators to push back on, because they could go, but it's in curriculum and it's in this. And so clearly, there's an age appropriate level here because it's within our policies, procedures and curriculum. However, now what that loud person is shouting is that trans people are groomers.
The first time I saw that, it just made me sick. And, when we talk about this US-UK thing, the US is saying groomers are shouting groomers, and the UK is saying this is a safeguarding issue, which again is that very, very clever reframing, right? This is a safeguarding issue. What's going on, Lauren?
What is being masked is the fact that when people are shouting that trans people are groomers, that we're shouting grooming, that this word grooming keeps coming up, it's shifting focus from sexual predators who are grooming, who, what grooming looks like with child sexual abuse, what grooming actually, like what that word means when it is being shouted loudly about trans people. It's very clearly being used to reframe that conversation, to move away from people who perpetrate grooming and kind of chuck this word on another group.
I think that you've said something really important, because I've noticed this a lot in these online spaces where people who perpetrate particular crimes will take the language around the crime that they're committing and apply it to another community. And in doing that, they shift focus away from themselves and onto another community. But they also ensure that they make the word meaningless, right? When we talk about grooming in the child sex abuse prevention work that we do, we're really, really clear that this is a deliberate act by adults to sexually abuse children. And there are steps that they take in order to get away with the abuse, right? And it's horrific. It's a horrific crime. But now any person who is trans or any parent who is allowing their trans child to exist is being labelled groomer, and it is. It's now meaningless. So when we go into spaces and we talk about grooming, that word's lost its power.
And we talked before about the fact that these, arguments from all of these spaces very clearly have no evidence.
Yeah.
And just to be really clear, the argument that trans people are sexual predators has no evidence.
None. And it, if it wasn't so heartbreaking, it would be boring, because this is what was said about gay men. It's an argument that's just always been used to other people who are just trying to live their lives.
Like literally just going to work, making dinner, doing literally what everyone else is doing.
Yeah. And as a parent of a trans kid, going home and getting yelled at for not doing your homework.
Exactly. But it's this thing of, if the argument there is if people did not other this group, they'd have to actually see them as people. And it becomes really hard to sit in a space of hate and throwing these kinds of words and just piles of terribleness at them if we actually just acknowledge the fact that they are people.
Yeah. Lauren, I've really enjoyed talking about the work that we do in supporting trans children and the acknowledgement that so many trans people have done this work long before we did and are more personally affected by it. And I would like to dedicate this episode to all of the trans and gender diverse people in our organisation, but particularly to our amazing producer, Jay Jones.
Love you, Jay.
Love you, Jay.
Thanks so much for listening along, everyone. We will see you next week. I'm Lauren French.
And I'm Deanne Carson.
And don't forget, the kids are okay. Thanks for joining us this week and making space for these hard chats. Thanks to our amazing podcast producer, Jay Jones, our podcast editor, Sam Carson, and our incredible composer of this music and all music you'll hear, Jade Perry. If you want us to answer your question box questions, head to our Instagram at Body Safety Australia and follow the link in our bio.